seen that's so interesting about the Nedbank Green Index is that even though it is made up using environmental rules, there seem to be very strong financial outcomes. As at the end of October 2012, we've seen that if we take the history back to the 1st of July 2009, outperformance compared to the All-Share Index of more than 40%. What's interesting about this is if you think about the fact that right now the Nedbank Green Index is being driven by climate change, which in many cases, while starting to be felt, is a medium-term to long-term issue, why is the outperformance coming through already? And so there were certain questions around that it raised for Nedbank and for the other people in the market who were looking at it saying, what's this being driven by? So one of the arguments was, if you look at the Nedbank Green Index, its exposure to financial companies, very similar to the All-Share Index, but the Nedbank Green Index is weighted towards industrials compared to resource companies. So what a lot of people are saying is, well, maybe what's happening is because you've got more industrial companies and they've done well, that's driving the outperformance. And we thought, well, maybe that is what it is. But let's not leave it there. Let's go further and do some work. So what we did is we Rescura Analytics, who is our independent index provider or index calculation agent, looked at all the data and independently ran tests. And the test was really looking at, are you getting outperformance because you're investing in sectors that are doing better? Or are you getting outperformance because of the companies you're picking within the sector? So are you actually picking the best in class or the best performers within each sector? And so they ran the data and they ran it against two sets of benchmarks. The one was the shareholder weighted version of the All-Share Index and the other was the top 40, because they're both very popular benchmarks. And what we saw is that in the first 6 months of the history of the index, which was the end of 2009, the sector allocation was important. So the fact that we were more in industrials and less in resources was driving a lot of the outperformance. But what we've seen is as the history of the index continues, so it goes for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, more and more of that outperformance is being driven by which companies are being selected. So what it's saying is that the methodology we use, this environmental methodology that says how well do these companies do in terms of dealing with climate change, is actually picking stronger companies. And so the question is, why is it doing that? How is it doing that? Now, while there's no definitive answer, we looked at the overseas literature because the overseas literature has found very similar things. The Carbon Disclosure Performance Index and the Carbon Disclosure Index, both of which have quite long histories, the one going back to 2005 and the other one going back to 2008, have also seen average or double return of their benchmark index, in this case the Global 500. So they're also seeing it. Goldman Sachs with their GS Sustain focus list, which is again motivated around these kind of factors, also outperforming. So we looked at the international literature, and what a lot of people seem to be saying is that it's rather than being a causal link, so managing the environment causally leads to financial, which is something we would expect in the long term around climate change, but not so soon. They're saying there's a correlation that's happening there, and the correlation seems to be with stronger management teams. You can't prove it because of the very reason that people don't know how to measure strong management. But this mysterious issue of how do you evaluate a management team seems to be carrying over into measuring companies based on their understanding of environmental issues. And if you think about some of the things they have to understand in order to deal with environmental issues, it makes a lot of sense. Because they have to get to grips with scientific material where there's often a lot of uncertainty. They have to figure out which is the kind of projection they should look at, who should they form partnerships with, and do they need to bring more people in to understand it? What operational changes do they need to make? They need to think about what are often medium-term to long-term issues, which is one of the things that people say good management teams do, is they think longer term, whereas your poorer management teams are going next quarter, next quarter, next quarter. And so it seems to be picking up these sorts of things, which is very interesting and helps to understand why we're seeing outperformance when in fact climate change is only in its first stages of making itself felt.